In this class we want to talk about types of research. Now this class overlaps to some considerable extent with other classes on the module, and it's important that you look at the other classes and this one because they give slightly different perspectives, and between the various classes that you'll find on this topic, make a more comprehensive set of notes and study each one from its separate perspective. In this way you'll get a much rounder understanding of the issues involved in research. So let's start by looking at the different types of research. First of all, there's descriptive research, which, as the name suggests, describes. So it may be a description of production systems in different companies. This could be presented verbally, and it is an account of how, let's say, production takes place in various businesses. And it may also be what academics consider to be good practice in business. So it's descriptive. It's making recommendations based on observations, perhaps based in other businesses or in the literature. So it's descriptive. Analytical research, by contrast, looks at data and tries to look at the underlying relationships in the data to try and work out what is best practice, for example, in business, and to analyze the data to see if there are any trends or movements that need to be exposed and understood by management. Next, there is applied research. Now, this is orientated towards solving a problem in business. Perhaps maybe the stores needs to be reorganized, or the production system is not smoothly meshing with the stores, or the logistical system, the distribution of the product, the warehousing, the delivery patterns that are used, the scheduling of vehicles and storage and that sort of thing. All of it perhaps is not fitting together correctly. So there is a problem because of this. Some applied research will be required to try and make recommendations to improve the situation. So applied research is trying to solve a problem. And it can be in any of the areas of business. Any of the functional areas may have a problem and may require some applied research to try and fix the problem. Fundamental research, by contrast, is research for knowledge's sake. It's trying to give us information about situations which is not directly usable. We don't use the knowledge. It's adding to our pool of knowledge as a species. It may be research into mathematics or into some obscure relationships in physics, looking at perhaps subatomic particles. And we want to know this. As a species, we're curious. We want to know about the world. We want to know about the relationships that apply in mathematics and so on. Perhaps in the future these discoveries will be very useful. Indeed, a lot of the computing industry has drawn on discoveries in mathematics in the past. So fundamental research is for knowledge's sake. It's adding to our sum of knowledge. It's not commercial. It's not something which is solving a problem. It is simply trying to discover fundamental relationships, mathematical relationships, scientific relationships, engineering relationships. Quantitative research, as the name suggests, use numbers. It may, in industry, it may be looking at warehousing, It may be looking at stock holding and looking at the relationship between stock holding and production, and perhaps the sale of the product may be seasonal, or it may have some sort of cyclical pattern. It's looking at those patterns of sales and tracing it back to trying to work out how much stock is required in the warehouse. So quantitative research is important. In fact, quantitative research is seen as one of the more important parts of research because it tends to be more objective. It's numbers, and numbers have to be dealt with as numbers. They're seen as, it's more scientific, it's more objective. Attitude and opinion research. Well, the government is always keen to find out what the citizens think about its policy, its economic policy, or its social policy, or its housing policy, or whatever. So it conducts opinion research to try and find out what do the voters think. And attitude research is important in industry to try and find out what the attitude of the customers are towards a particular product. How do the customers feel about its design, or some innovation in the product? How do they feel about the product overall? Qualitative research is important in the behavioral sciences. Qualitative research is looking at attitudes and opinions and motivations. What is it that drives people in certain ways? What is it that motivates people in certain ways? It's qualitative. And there are techniques in research which help the researchers to undertake this type of work. Attitudinal scales, for example, the Likert scale, which is the subject of a separate video. That will be looking at how strong do people feel about certain situations. So it may use a scale, say a 5-point Likert scale would be totally disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, totally agree. Now, there's 5 points. So people's attitudes towards some event could be they strongly agree, or they just agree, or they disagree. So their attitudes are being picked up in this way. There are criticisms of the technique. It is controversial and it could be debated, but it is used. So qualitative research analyzes the various factors which motivate people to behave in a particular manner, or which make people like or dislike a particular thing. So qualitative research is very important. It is subject to criticism, as I said. Issues are like bias and how accurate information can be picked up, and strength of preference, and there are lots of issues, but these are dealt with elsewhere. Motivation research. Well, this type of qualitative research aims at discovering the underlying motives and desires, and usually involves in-depth interviews. It's concerned with the determination of motivations underlying customer behaviour. If we're dealing with business research, it tries to look at customer behaviour, let's say, and looks at what are the motivations of the customer. What are the consumers looking for? Cheapness, good quality, good after-sales service. What exactly is most important? What motivates the customer to buy or not to buy? And most of the techniques in this sort of area will be borrowed from psychology. Psychologists engage in this type of research very extensively. It may be that it uses word association tests or sentence completion tests or story completion tests. Clearly, this is very specialized, and this type of research should be only undertaken by trained personnel, trained researchers, normally people with good qualifications and background in this type of work, and also coming from a psychology background. Empirical research, well, empirical means done by experiment, and a lot of times we don't actually experiment, so it's a slight abuse of the word. But empirical here means practical research, looking at data and looking at issues to try and work out from the data some underlying pattern. It relies on experience or observation. A lot of it is to do with being involved. It's not an experiment, but it's looking at situations as if they were experiments and trying to see if it can work out what the underlying relationships are. It's a data-based research approach, coming up with conclusions which are capable of being verified by observation or by experiment. So it tries to work out the relationships by making observations or collecting data and analysing the data. So it draws up conclusions, but the conclusions then can be retested again, because the situation may arise again and more data collected and tested again using the same approach. And what the researcher is trying to do is to confirm or reject the hypothesis. The hypothesis is a testable statement. So with empirical research, the researcher comes up with a testable statement. If the price is lowered, more will be sold. That's a testable statement. It collects, or he or she collects data. When the price is lowered, it looks at the increased sales, let's say. And then it comes up with a solution or a conclusion. It says the hypothesis has been confirmed. A reduction in price leads to more sales. So the hypothesis is confirmed. Now it may do the experiment again later, or it may reenact or play out that whole scenario again in the future. It may wait for the next cut in price. The same hypothesis is tested. Now they look for increased sales, and if there are increased sales, then they go back and say the original hypothesis has been confirmed again. Or they might find, of course, it's been contradicted, in which case they try to explain the mismatch between the two sets of results. It's necessary to get the data source and analyze it to derive research outcomes. The researcher must use a working hypothesis or guess as to the probable results. The working hypothesis enables the researcher to suggest what is likely to happen and then test that hypothesis. The researcher must analyze the facts to test the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is the testable statement. A reduction in price leads to more sales. That's the hypothesis, let's say. Let's assume. Now, when the price is cut, observe what happens to sales. If it increases, the hypothesis has been confirmed. If it doesn't increase, the hypothesis is rejected. That is the basis upon which empirical research works. Descriptive research, or what's known as ex post facto research. This is an attempt by the researcher to discover causes, even when they cannot control the variables. So the researcher is trying to find out what caused what, even though it can't control any variables. It can't intervene and experiment. It can't look at situations in isolation. So it's trying to work out nonetheless what's going on, what's causing what. Its main purpose is to describe current events and observations in an effort to explain them. So it describes the current events and observations and tries to explain what is happening. But the researcher has no control over the variables. He or she can only report what has happened or what is happening and try to explain what is happening. And that is the nature of descriptive research. It is describing what is happening and trying to make sense of it. Longitudinal research. Well, this is carried out over several time periods. Longitudinal means over time. And longitudinal research means taking different periods of time and looking at variables over a period of time. Looking at, say, within the company, looking at production over a period of time, over a year or over 2 years, or whatever. Looking over certain periods of time. That is longitudinal research. That has to be contrasted with what's known as cross-sectional research. Cross-sectional research happens at a moment in time. The researcher is like taking a picture. The researcher analyzes what happens at an instant. Why is this relationship or this system the way it is right now? That is cross-sectional. If it looks at how the system changes over time, that's longitudinal. Over time, longitudinal. There's also clinical or diagnostic research. It follows a case study approach or in-depth approaches to reach basic causal relations. So the clinical or diagnostic approach looks at case studies, looks at what has happened and tries to work out from the case study what the approaches are or were and what caused what. Case studies can go deep into the causes of things or events that interest us, using very small samples and very deep probing data gathering devices. So it's very deep probing data gathering devices. So a case study can be a very good vehicle for research. It's a good way of researching. A case study is in-depth. So it gives a very detailed picture and is often used. Exploratory research. Its main objective is the development of hypotheses rather than their testing. Exploratory is just looking across the situation. If it's within a company, looking across the marketing department and looking at how the marketing department functions, let's say, or the personnel section or the production section, whatever. Looking across one of the departments, how they work, how they operate, and developing hypotheses, developing ideas about what the relationships are and how the work is being carried out. They're exploring the departments and their procedures to try and find hypotheses that can be tested. Formalized research, well, these studies are those with substantial structure and specific hypotheses to be tested. Formalized, as the word suggests, formalized, very formal, very strict testing procedures, very strict hypotheses, and the research only focuses on the hypothesis and on the structure as laid out. It's a very formalized way of approaching research. Historical research, well, this looks at documents and it looks at artifacts from the past and tries to study situations that were around in the past to see if any light can be shed on current practices. Now, within a business, surprisingly enough, historic research can be used. Businesses that have existed for many years will have changed practice. Production systems will have changed and the office layout will have changed and so on. So there will be a contrast between the current situation and what applied in the past. And we learn from the past. So even though we're talking about historic research, companies have history, and sometimes procedures and ways of operating in the past are a good indicator of what is good practice today within that sector. So the data from the past can be valuable. Target-orientated research. In this, the researcher is free to pick up a problem and also to redesign an inquiry as it proceeds. So in other words, the researcher is very flexible with this one. The researcher sees an issue, starts to research it. As the research proceeds, the researcher observes some change, and the research itself may change as a consequence. So the researcher is very flexible about his or her procedures. Decision-orientated research, well, it's for the decision maker. It's aimed at the decision maker, and it's a very important function of research to help the decision maker be aware of all of the factors that should be taken into account when making decisions, and help the decision maker make effective decisions. The researcher is not free to embark upon research according to his own inclination or her own inclination. The researcher follows what is required by the decision maker. There are examples of techniques that are used here. For example, operational research or operations research. These are scientific methods of providing executive departments with quantitative basis for their decisions regarding the operations under their control. In the literature, there are many techniques, mathematical techniques, that may be used which may help decision making. For example, queuing theory, linear programming, integer programming, PERT, stock control. There are many specialized topics that have been worked out over the years and which come together in a literature which is called operations research or operational research. So it refers to the application of mathematical, logical or analytical techniques to the solution of business problems and the problem of cost minimization or of profit maximization or just general optimization, making the best of the situation. So there is a literature that management may consult, they may wish to consult. If they're looking at stores management, there are generalized principles written up in operations research literature that the management may consult, which will talk about optimal stock holding and issues surrounding stocks, or queuing, if jobs have to be queued, how should they be queued, and so on. So there is a literature that may be consulted. Market research is something we talk about all the time. It's an investigation into the structure and development of markets. The idea is to formulate policies regarding purchasing, production and sales. It's looking at the market situation. How is the market functioning? How is the market for the product? How do customers see the product? But also it's looking at the market situation for purchasing. So market research is to look at what the customer thinks about the product, the price, the quality, and so on. What the business is paying for raw materials and looking at the market for raw materials. That's market research. It's looking at the costs of transport and looking at the alternatives in distribution and transport and in storage and so on. So it's looking at all of the market situations that confront the business. Now, the types of research approach, well, there's the quantitative approach that I've mentioned, which involves generating data in quantitative form, then rigorously analysing that quantitative data to try and find underlying patterns. There's the inferential approach. Now, to form a database from which to infer characteristics or relationships of the population. So it collects the data and it structures the data into different formats according to name, location, income levels, whatever it is, sales, past sales or whatever. And it then attempts to work out relationships. Means survey research, where a sample of the population is studied, questioned or observed to determine the characteristics. It looks at the characteristics of the population. It looks at the relationships that the database perhaps that has been accumulated over a period of time, what the database is suggesting, that there is a cluster of people in a certain area who are interested in the product, that the product sells more to males than females, the product sells at for a certain age group, so there are different strata interested in the product. It's trying to infer who's interested in the product and what its market characteristics are. So it's looking at the overall characteristics. The experimental approach, well, greater control over the research environment, and some variables are manipulated to observe their effects on to the other variables. So the experimental approach is to try and work out how one variable influences another. A reduction in the price of the product leads to an increase in sales. Is there a causal connection? And how does price and sales link? How are they related? So it's looking for relationships of that nature. There's also a simulation approach. Now, this means trying to build a model of some relationship. For example, will customers buy more if the price is reduced? Well, simulations may be that it may be tried out on a small scale in some area to see what happens to sales. The price is reduced in one area, will sales increase in that area? And if they do, it's an indicator that perhaps if the price was reduced all across the market, then there would be an increase in sales all across the market. It's simulated. So there's the initial condition, the initial price of the product, let's say. The parameters, an exogenous variable. Well, the parameters are how much income do people have to spend on the product, how much employment is there in the area, what's the population size of the area, what are the past sales like in the area. These are the parameters, let's say, if we're talking about looking at the demand for a product. The exogenous variables are the variables outside of the control of the business. The level of income in the area, the number of people living in the area, the initiatives by government to improve the area, build more housing or whatever. These are exogenous. They are outside of the model that the company is using. But the simulation approach, trying to look at small-scale changes and then trying to extrapolate into what would happen if this applied more generally. So it's trying to construct an artificial environment in which relevant information and data can be generated. So it's small scale, trying to see what happens so it becomes big. It permits an observation of a dynamic behavior of a system or its subsystem under controlled conditions. So the company has got control over where it sells the product, and it might pick just one small area to try to see what happens if the price is varied. How much more will be sold in that area. So it knows what the sales in the area was historically, then it cuts the price and makes an observation of how much is sold after the reduction in price, and if it's significant, they have worked out that the sales of the product are price sensitive. So it's a very useful approach to building models for understanding future conditions. Now, there's also the qualitative approach. It's concerned with subjective assessment of attitudes, opinions, and behavior. Techniques are focus groups, interviews, projective techniques, and in-depth interviews. So there are all sorts of techniques that may be used in the qualitative approach. That's all we're going to do in this session. It's quite a long session, so we're going to leave it at that. Much of the material that we've covered in here will have appeared in other videos in the module, so it's important to go back and look at those videos as well, look at this one, and make a much more detailed set of notes out of the various videos on this topic, and prepare your own notes and do some research into the area yourself. Perhaps go online and look up some of the particular approaches and techniques that we've talked about in conducting business research. But that's all I'm going to do in this session, so I'm going to leave it at that. Say thank you for watching.